Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Thank God We Don't Have to Watch These lectures at 8:30 in the morning. So I hope you guys are hunkering down okay and staying safe and healthy. So for today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the roots of the concept of race. And the reason that we're talking about this is basically because we've done in this class so far a progression from the basics of evolution and genetics to the history of the evolution of hominins, of our lineage, up to Homo sapiens. And now we're going to be talking a little bit about modern human variation. So just characterizing what modern humans are like biologically and how we might vary across the globe and what we know about that. The race concept obviously is an important thing in our society today, and it has a long and troubled history in the modern world. And so it's important to look at how this concept came about, number one. Number two, whether there's any validity to it from a biological standpoint, from a scientific standpoint. And number three, what is the best way to characterize the type of biological variation we see in modern humans today? So this lecture here is largely based on this book. This book with a very stark cover titled The History of White People. This is a book that I carried around with me when I was doing my dissertation research in Poland. And I was on all manner of public transportation trying to hide the cover of this book. So, lest anyone think I was reading some kind of crazy white supremacist literature. But as you'll see, it's actually like a really interesting take on the history of race, because it's looking at race not only as a way to characterize people of color, but as a way to create a privileged group of so-called white people. So this is a book that's written by a woman named Nell Irvin Painter. And here's a little something about her. There's a video about her at the end of this PowerPoint, which I'm not showing in the video, but of course you can watch it from the PowerPoint. So she is a retired professor of American history from Princeton University. She has a bachelor's in anthropology, so that's pretty awesome. A master's degree in African history from UCLA, and a PhD in American history from Harvard. Okay, so just to prove to you, it's not written by some kind of kook white supremacist. So one of the things she talks about is how deep does this concept of race, as we know it today, how deep does that concept go? Was there an idea of race in antiquity? And long story short, no, there wasn't. Since kind of the advent of the written word in different parts of the world, there have been people who have written historical or pseudo-historical documents, and we can take a look at how they described other peoples. So in the Western tradition, right, that means looking at a lot of Greek historians and writers. So she mentions a few of them who are discussing people from the non-Greek world. So in this time, there really wasn't a concept of, say, like a unified Europe, or unified politically or unified racially, quote unquote. So when they talked about barbarians, which is a Greek word that, as I hear it, comes from a sort of onomatopoeia of what it sounded like to Greeks when non-Greeks would speak, like bar 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 bar. So apparently that's where the word barbarian comes from. And so they would discuss people like the Scythians, who were prehistoric tribes, prehistoric meaning that they didn't have the written word in their own society. In Central Asia and Eastern Europe, they were nomadic. So this picture there on the upper part of the screen, the upper right, is supposed to be a representation of Amazon warriors who were said to be or thought to be Scythians, and also Celts. So I picked like a crappy representation of a Celtic type individual there on the bottom right. When they're talking about these barbarian peoples, these people that are foreign to the civilized Greek world, they note their appearance, of course. You know, they note their appearance in terms of height, build, hair, kind of complexion and all that sort of thing. But they don't describe them in racial terms. They don't describe them as a biological entity that is completely self-contained and unique. They ascribe physical characteristics and cultural characteristics and psychological characteristics oftentimes to climate. They'll say that people that are in climates that are temperate, where there's a winter and there's a summer and it goes from one extreme to another extreme, as being sort of impetuous and bold and warlike sometimes, and people in more consistent climates to be, you know, either like thoughtful, or if it's too warm a climate or something, you know, maybe lazy. So they're thinking in these terms and not so much in terms of an immutable biological property of these people, right? And moreover, for the Greeks, it was really more, there's a Greek world and there's everybody else. It wasn't like there's a European world and then there's an Asian world and then there's a sub-Saharan African world, and that, you know, they weren't really thinking in those terms. So when discussing like where exactly this modern idea of race comes from, she places the real important beginnings of it in the 18th century, meaning like the 1700s. So this was a process of sort of the development of this idea that went through the 17 and 1800s. And of course it continued on and modified and became more elaborate even into the 20th century. But basically it's a historical process, and it has to do with the way that Europe interfaced with the world during this time. So it's kind of a parade of names, so just try to stay with me on this. I won't ask you questions about every single one of these people. There are going to be some key figures and key ideas here. But first of all, let me start by saying, when we're talking about race, we're talking about the idea that there are discrete groups of people, populations of people, who, in order for race to mean anything at all, it must signify that people within a certain population are more similar to each other than they are to people in another population. So you have these sort of circumscribed groups, right? And so that implies that they're biologically more similar, and a lot of times in the history of race, along with biology, has come the idea of intellect, of culture, of traditions, of temperament, right? That people assume has a biological origin, right? So that's what makes this concept of race sort of a unique historical concept. So there's a lot of things going on this graph here, and I'm going to show you several graphs, this graph several times as we go along, just to show you where these individuals are on the graph, on the timeline. So during the 1700s and the 1800s, what you have going on is, obviously, you have Europeans have been traveling around the world trying to get spices, trying to get gold, trying to open up markets for their products, trying to find lands on which they can grow cash crops. And then there was the slave trade, right? And so that was a source of free labor for these cash crops, basically, for things like tobacco and sugar and cotton, and to a lesser extent, coffee, things like this, right? So Europeans are increasingly coming in contact with other parts of the world, and they're doing so in a situation of sort of a power imbalance, right? So that's going on. You see on the timeline, you've got sort of a first stage of French colonialism. You've got the Industrial Revolution, which really sped up the process of the slave trade and the need for labor for things, especially like cotton. And you've also got these two periods. The Enlightenment is a general large period where in Europe people are starting to put science on a more equal footing with religion as a way of knowing the world. So during the Enlightenment, people start classifying things. So binomial nomenclature, like Homo sapiens or Pan-paniscus, which is orangutans, I believe, or bonobos. I can't remember. Pan troglodytes, that's chimpanzees. This way of classifying nature comes from Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish naturalist, and that occurred during this period of the Enlightenment. People are very much into creating types and categorizing things and making everything as, quote, scientific as possible, but they do it by using one type, one individual, basically, to represent an entire group of other individuals. So it's not really done in a very statistically sound, scientific kind of way. The Romantic period is almost a backlash to the Enlightenment, where people are starting to say, hey, you know what? Traditions and emotions and not just classical art and Greek art and Roman art, but also like our own national traditions are just as important, because in the Enlightenment, people were heavily focused on the classics, Greeks and Romans. They almost worshipped them. And in the Romantic period, people started turning inward more, and there were a lot of movements of nationalism that were happening during that time. Okay, so that sort of frames what's going on here. So the first character we're going to talk about is Johann Winckelmann, who was a German, although there wasn't exactly a Germany as we know it today at that time. So there's a lot of Johanns here. This is one of the Johanns, Johann Joachim Winckelmann. Living in the first half of the 18th century. He was considered the father of art history, and you might think, what does someone connected to art history have to do with the idea of race? Which is a good question to ask. It'll become apparent, though. So basically, he was really into classical art. He studied it in Italy. He would have loved to go to Greece because he really fetishized Greek classical art. But Greece at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, and that was sort of off limits for most Europeans. So he settled for studying classical art in Italy. And something that's interesting about that is in Italy, they didn't have a lot of Greek originals. They had Roman copies of Greek art. And the Roman copies used a different medium, a different type of marble. It was more pasty white. And the Greeks had actually painted their originals. So the skin tone would have been different. The clothes would have been different. The hair would have been different. But the Romans kind of left that marble as it was. He didn't know that, though, and he thought that Greek art was just the most beautiful, the highest expression of culture in the world. And he thought that the people represented in Greek art were among the absolute most beautiful aesthetically. And so this picture on the bottom is Apollo Belvedere, a Greek god that he thought was the most perfect looking human that could ever possibly exist, even though he wasn't exactly a human and didn't exist. But he wrote influential treatises on sort of the history of art, especially in the classical period. And those became widely read among intellectual circles. And he sort of if not lit this fire, at least tossed fuel on the fire of real appreciation for the classics and classical art. Overlapping with Winckelmann and living into the 19th century, we have Goethe, which I can never say with a straight face, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, also from what we would now call Germany. He was sort of a polymath. He did a lot of things. He was a writer, intellectual. He was a diplomat. He wrote a lot of plays and literature, and was extremely famous not only in the German-speaking world, but also later in the English-speaking world and throughout European society. And he was really influenced by Winckelmann's thoughts on Greek art, especially in classical works. And so because he was so prestigious and so well known, he really spread the name and the ideas of Winckelmann wide. And he even tied like German mythology and sort of German art in with Greek art. So in some of his works, he kind of mixed the two. I believe he does this in one of his most famous works about Faust. So if you've ever heard of the Faustian deal, like the devil went down to Georgia, you know, that kind of thing where you sell your soul to be the best at something or whatever. That was a big part of this idea of his work when he wrote Faust. And in that work, he sort of blends German mythology and Greek mythology. And so, as Painter says, German intellectuals started at that point to claim ancient Greek bodies and culture as their true ancestors, you know, because they're saying, wow, these people are so great. We're obviously so great. So there must be a connection there. Kind of overlapping with both of these individuals, we have someone by the name of Petrus Camper living throughout a large portion of the 18th century, the 1700s. And Petrus Camper was an artist on the one hand, and an illustrator, and also an anatomist. People could do whatever the hell they wanted in those days. So, if they had enough money. So, he was kind of coming up with, better ways to draw a really anatomically correct, symmetrical kind of face. And so he used his knowledge of anatomy to do that. And he came up with some ways of kind of measuring the skull, looking at the skull. But his big contribution was this thing called the facial angle, which I suppose is somewhat a measure of prognatism. So how much the face kind of juts out from the rest of the head. And I think the facial angle on this picture is kind of this angle here. I don't know if you could see that well, where it's kind of going from the forehead to the nose, and then the other line goes from the nose kind of through the ear. And so the angle made from the vertical, I believe, is a facial angle. And he carried on this idea of Greek beauty, especially the beauty of Greek gods as being the highest form of beauty. And down below is one of his more famous drawings. So you see like an orangutan skull or a chimpanzee skull there. Then you see the skull of, I want to say it's either, according to him, Kalmuk, which was like a word for a certain people of Asia at the time, or it might be an African, and then the next one is the other. I think it's an African, a Kalmuk. I might have that mixed up. Then a European, and then the Greek god. So, according to him, he's organizing these skulls in terms of facial angle. Now, at the time, they're not incorporating variation in any group. They're choosing representative skulls that they feel like, all right, we have a sample size of one, good enough, and we're going to characterize entire groups on this basis. Now, when you look at this graph, this picture, the thing that most people at the time would have seen is, oh, look, the European skull is the closest to the Greek god, the closest to divinity, the closest to perfect. And The others are more towards the animal kingdom side of things, Now, according to Camper, he really thought that this showed the near parity or the near equality of humankind, that actually the human skulls were all closer to each other in facial angle than any of them were to either the other primates or to the Greek god. So in his mind, this is like an argument for, sort of more or less the equality of humankind. But that's not how it was seen by what we would call scientific racists of the time. Then we have another Johann, I believe, Lavater, again, overlapping with these periods, living slightly into the 19th century. And he's known as the father of physiognomy. Now, physiognomy was this pseudo-scientific study of judging a person's character based on their outward appearance. And he came up with this idea that you could tell someone's personality by looking at their face. And he sort of broke it down into the humors, if you've ever heard this term before. If not, you should look it up. That tell you something about the sort of temperament of individuals. You have the phlegmatic, you have the choleric, you have the sanguine, you have the melancholic. So some of them are industrious and practical. Some of them are sort of dreamy and lazy. Some of them are, sort of sad and pessimistic all the time. And so that picture on the bottom right is sort of a representation of what the faces of these different temperaments would look like. If you've ever heard of phrenology, where people would sort of feel someone's skull, feel the bumps, feel the topology of the skull, and be like, oh, you're going to be a criminal in 20 years or something like that. That's very much tied in with this idea of physiognomy, that you can tell something about someone's internal character from their external appearance. And why this is important is because this gives the pseudo-scientific movement, remember being perceived as being scientific was very important in the Enlightenment, right? So this provides a link between aspects of personality and intellect and character with biology, right? So if you can quantify somehow the shape of the face or the skull and connect that with a personality or abilities, you've made that link, right? So obviously these findings were eventually discredited by serious scholars, but this idea was very attractive to scientific racists at the time. And when I'm talking about scientific racists, I mean people who were looking for ways to justify the burgeoning social order of the day, the sort of pre-industrial capitalism, where obviously there was a certain strata of society with more wealth and power, and connected with that was industry, was the slave trade, was colonialism, right? So you're looking for ways to justify these things that otherwise, in the still Christian mentality of Europe at the day, would seem anathema to the ideas of Christianity, the ideas of everybody coming from Adam and Eve and everybody being children of God. How could you treat other children of God this way? Well, if you were able to show that actually there's some individuals are closer to the animal kingdom, some groups than others, and maybe there's this paternalistic take of like, well, those of us toward the top, we can kind of take care of and look down on the others and, do God's bidding with them. That was sort of an attractive idea for kind of quelling this cognitive dissonance between Christian beliefs and the realities of colonialism and the slave trade. Then we've got another guy, John Hunter. John Hunter was Scottish, influenced by Camper, and he did some more work with human skulls and animal skulls and created these types: the European, the Asian, the American, the African, right? Again, taking one skull or one sample and using it to represent an entire population. And if you think of it in terms of the history of the time, Europeans were to some extent competing with East Asia economically. They wanted resources and spices from East Asia, but the Chinese pretty much had everything that they needed, didn't really want a lot from Europeans, asked, if they were going to trade with Europeans, they asked for gold. There was sort of a power struggle there. The American is from the, relatively recently colonized Americas, right? So they were a colonized people. The African, obviously Africans were being used in large numbers in the slave trade. So you can see where the origin of these groups as distinct comes from, right? It's a socio-political, historical kind of thing. Okay, then you've got another individual, Charles White from Manchester, England, which was a big sort of industrial area at the time. He was a physician and an obstetrician. He was interested in natural history. He's also comparing human and animal skulls. And you can see he really carried it to the extreme. If you look at one of his more famous drawings there on the bottom, he goes from like birds and reptiles with like long, really prognathtic faces to different breeds of dogs, even to like apes and chimpanzees, and then to humans, right? So all the way to sort of Apollo Belvedere there at the end, that sort of Greek god with a really flat face. So he had this belief in polygenesis, which means there wasn't just one act of creation, there were separate acts of creation. So although, when God created mankind, he might have created mankind equal, but there were different levels of mankind, and perhaps they weren't organized in the same hierarchy. And his ideas were very influential among American scientific races of the 1800s, the 19th century. This guy is an important character to remember, Johann Blumenbach, who was living in both the sort of Enlightenment period and the Romantic period. He also created several different measurements of the skull, some of which we use today for a variety of things. But basically, he was more thorough and more scientific in his approach than Lavater, for example, or Camper. And he also used these types. And throughout his time, he tried to classify different numbers of groups into pseudo-racial categories. He didn't call them races exactly, he called them varieties, but the translation into Latin was race. And he actually added the idea of skin color to this classification. And so as not to make this video too long, I'll sort of summarize that at the time there were a lot of like historical travel writings by people who were not historians or scientists, just wealthy people who were engaged in trade, who would write about their travels to exotic places. And there was this myth that people of the Caucasus, like the country of Georgia, were among the most beautiful in the world. And so this idea of beauty was very appealing. It was an idea that was prevalent in the assessment of classical art. And in sort of the Eurocentric mind at the time, obviously Europeans were considered to be the most beautiful, right? So creating these categories of peoples, tying them to ideas of beauty and beauty to character, all right, through physiognomy, and connecting skin color to that, sort of brought together all the threads that were present in the idea of race as it continued to develop. So he, in his writings, created a variety of different classifications. Sometimes he had 4, sometimes he had 5. He knew a guy who only had 2 classifications of humans, sort of ugly and beautiful. And he's like, well, we can't say exactly how many there are. You can kind of choose. I'm going to stick with 5. And the funny thing is, he had the Ethiopian, which represented sub-Saharan Africa. He had like the Asian, the European. He might have had the American. I can't remember exactly, but he also had this skull that he acquired from a friend who was doing trading somewhere in like Polynesia or Melanesia, and he's like, "Ooh, get me a skull." And somehow this guy got him a skull, and he added it to his collection, and that was a new group of people. Just like that, boom, one skull from one part of the world became a new group of people. But one thing that's important about him in the history of white people, quote unquote, is that he created the idea of the Caucasian. So he named the European variety, which was in skin tone quite light, and was one of the most beautiful skulls, of course. He named it Caucasian because the idea of the most beautiful people in the world was tied to the Caucasus, was tied to like Georgia, Armenia, that area, which is really technically in Asia, but he made that sort of the foundation of his idea of the European variety, and he called it Caucasian. His skull that represented the Caucasian variety was actually from a Georgian woman who was taken as a sex slave by Russian soldiers, and sadly died of, I believe, syphilis. So it's a really ugly history, but he takes this skull, and this is the most prized possession in his collection, and he thinks it's beautiful, and that becomes the type that represents Caucasian, right? So it's weird that that word has such a bizarre, twisted history. Really is talking about an area in Asia, and yet is used even on census forms to describe people of European and North African and West Asian descent today. Then we've got this guy, Sir William Jones. So when I was talking about North Africa and West Asia, certain parts of India and whatnot, that came into the picture because this guy, Sir William Jones, was a linguist who came up with the idea of an Indo-European language family, because he noticed there were similarities between ancient Greek and ancient Sanskrit, and he started piecing together relationships between a lot of the languages of Europe and some of the languages of Western Asia. And he noticed that they must have had sort of a common origin. So this idea kind of grew into the notion of an Indo-European people that were part of this Caucasian variety. And obviously the later century, a century and a half or so later, the Nazis took this idea and kind of turned it into Aryan, these like Aryan invaders who conquered part of India, and they said, oh, we must be related to those individuals. So that takes us to Christoph Meiners, who was also from what's now Germany. He was actually a colleague of Blumenbach's. Definitely sort of an avowed racist, even though they didn't really use that term in their days. But he definitely took a sort of social Darwinistic approach, saying like, Painter says, quote, "Meiners made no bones about it. Inferior people's inferiority justified, even required their enslavement and the use of despotism for their control." So he took this view of like, we're superior, they're inferior, therefore we should control them for their own good. And he was the one that came up with this idea of two races, one sort of beautiful race, which was above all not just European, but sort of like German, and one ugly race, which included the Kalmucks, the Asians, the Africans, and kind of everybody else. And he also was influenced by this old Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about Germanic tribes who were not German in the modern day parlance. And, Tacitus said something about them mostly marrying within their own or whatever. And he took this idea and said, aha, there's the evidence we need that the Germans are a racially pure people and clearly are at least as good as the Greeks. So anyway, that all kind of tied together to this notion of race. If you want, you can watch this video of Nell Painter kind of talking a bit more coherently and eloquently about her book. But just to summarize, the idea is that this notion of discrete populations of people who are biologically, culturally, intellectually, temperamentally more similar to each other than they are to other groups is a construct of the 18th and 19th centuries, and didn't really exist before then. There were religious differences, there were political differences, but there really weren't this idea of racial differences being inscribed in someone's biology before that time. Okay, so that is the end of today's lecture. I will be back for a lecture on Wednesday, kind of unpacking what do we know actually about the biology of human variation, and does that support or refute the idea of race. Until then, I will sign off now and see you later.